Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Najmeh Miramirkhani, and it's a joint work with Mahati Apini and my advisors Nick Nikiforakis and Michalis Polikoronakis. So I'm going to talk about the Spotless Sandboxes, which is about evading malware analysis systems using wear-and-tear artifacts. So I first overview different evasion and evasion prevention techniques, and then I will introduce a new evasion technique based on wear-and-tear artifacts, and then we build the model in order to predict the real age of a system to help sandboxes, and finally I concluded with different countermeasures. So the volume and sophistication of malware is increasing every day, and the only way to cope with this volume of attack is to automate this process. So the current approach, which is widely adopted, is the automated dynamic malware analysis techniques. In dynamic malware analysis technique, malware is getting executed in a controlled environment called sandboxes, and then its behavior will be observed. So sandboxes can be easily automated, but they face a big problem, which is the environment-aware malware. Environment-aware malware can probe its environment, and if it detects that it's running in a sandbox, it will stop execution or stop doing any malicious activity, and then in this way it will evade the sandbox. So there are different techniques that an invasive malware can use in order to bypass the sandbox. For example, it can use instrumentation artifacts, or it can use VM detection techniques such as using virtualization artifacts or red pills or timing attacks. So there are different defenses which are proposed in order to stop evasive malware. The first one is to just try to make a sandbox to look like a real system. But the problem with this approach is that it would be very difficult to make a virtual environment to be completely the same as a real system. So the other two solutions which are proposed is to just run a malware in an actual hardware on a bare metal system, or to just run a malware on multiple environments and then observe its behavior in different environments. So considering this arms race, one natural question is that what can an attacker do if all the traces have been removed from the analysis systems? Or what can be the next step for the attacker? So can we come up with a generic approach that can evade even bare metal systems? So if we look at the current evasion techniques, we see that they look into the current state of the system, and they actually try to check how realistic a system looks like. But if the sandbox has removed all the traces, there is no way to detect a sandbox. But we notice that there is one aspect of the system that is different from a sandbox, and even if all these traces have been removed, and that is the past use of the system. So we introduce a new evasion technique, which instead of looking into how realistic a system looks like, they look into how realistic its past use look like. The intuition behind this idea is simple. So when a user uses a system, wear-and-tear artifacts occurs in the system as a result of normal use. But in malware analysis systems, they usually roll back to a clean state, which is essentially a vanilla installation of an operating system with some changes. So if we rely on the wear and tear or aging of a system, it should be able to distinguish between a real system and a sandbox. So in order to study the feasibility of this idea, we first need to extract some features that shows the usage of a system or the age of a system. So we looked into 5 different aspects of a system in order to extract sub-features. The first one is the network. So whenever a user connects to a wireless network or try to resolve a domain name or try to get the MAC address of a gateway, data will be cached in the ARP cache, DNS cache, or SSID will be cached. So we group together all such traces on the network category. The other aspect of the system is the browser. The browser stores the states of user interaction with the website, so we can extract the previous browsing activity of a user from the data stored in the browser, such as the cookies, visited URLs, or bookmarks, or the downloaded files, and so forth. Registry is another source that we extract wear-and-tear artifacts. So essentially, we extract the footprints of installing or uninstallation of applications, and we also collect information about the different caches of the system, such as stream cache or MUI cache from the registry. Event log of a system is another rich source that we can extract past user activity of past user activities. So we extract such features from the event log, and we put together with other characteristics of the system under the system category. And the last aspect of the system is the disk or file system. So we look into the changes that happen into the file system in the form of like deleted files, cached data, or temporary files, and we extract wear and tear features. So in order to collect the data, we implemented the prop tool, which is essentially a Windows PE file, and when it gets executed, it will collect all the information, all the wear and tear, the values of wear and tear artifacts, and it will send it back to our server. So just one point I need to mention here is that in order to select wear and tear features, we are just limited to the privacy safe features because we are collecting data from real users. But in principle, an attacker can choose like many more sophisticated wear and tear artifacts, and which can be stronger than the artifacts we collected. For example, searching for specific files or specific applications installed on a system. But even with such a limitation, we show that our artifacts would be able to detect sandboxes with a high accuracy. So we performed a larger scale study on 270 real users that were mostly Amazon Turk workers, and they were from 28 different countries around the world. And we also collected data from fresh installations of different versions of Windows from our local VMs and also public clouds in order to have a baseline to compare the results. In order to collect the values of wear and tear artifacts from sandboxes, we submitted our prop tools to different malware analysis systems, and in this way we collected data from them. And also, we also noticed that when we submitted our prop tool, we got multiple reports because they usually try to share the samples with each other or may try to run one sample on multiple machines to observe its behavior. So let's take a look at the values of wear and tear artifact in real systems and in sandboxes to see how these values will be different in real systems and sandboxes. So I just go through one or two examples of a couple of categories, but you can find like more information or the details of all the artifacts on the paper. So from the system artifacts, the history of Windows updates is directly related to the age of the system. And as you can see, it has wider and larger values in real systems than sandboxes. So it can be a very good feature in order to detect sandboxes. But in case of time difference between the first and last event log, you see that it has larger values for the sandboxes. And as we will see later, this is because the sandboxes, they usually try to fake their ages. So from the registry artifacts, one example is the number of entries in the shim cache, and as you see, it follows the same pattern, and the two distributions, the distribution in real system and sandboxes are completely different, so it can be a very good feature. But in case of the total number of shared DLLs, we see that the two distributions have overlap with each other, which makes it a little bit less powerful feature. So now we use all these features and put them together to see how well it can predict a sandbox. So we train a decision tree model on a data set of real users, sandboxes, and baselines. And we also apply a 10 trial adaptive boosting in order to increase the accuracy. And we also change the cost matrix in favor of false positive, because this is what an attacker would prefer to have, because an attacker prefers to miss a real system rather than compromising the sandbox. So to evaluate this model, we test the model on an unseen data set of real users and sandboxes, and we come up with an accuracy of 92%, which is promising. But the question is that what will happen to this technique if the sandboxes try to patch some of these artifacts? So does this model just like break or become useless, or it can survive and resist against these kind of patches? So what we do here is that we remove the features one by one, and then we also consider the worst case scenario in which the sandbox always try to remove the most effective or the best feature. And every time we train a new classifier, calculate the accuracy, false positive and false negative. And as you see here, even after removing 60% of the features, the accuracy stays more than 90%. And as the attacker would prefer, the false negative rate is lower than the false positive rate. So we can say that in total, this model would be able to predict sandboxes with a high accuracy, and it's also resilient against different patches that may be done by sandboxes. So if you look at this CDF, which shows the claim age of a real user and a sandbox, we see that sandboxes, the claim age of the sandboxes is usually more than the claim age of the users. So the question is that, is it really because these systems have been created long time ago and they have been actively in use over time, or they're just faking their ages and try to report an unrealistic age? So to understand, to answer this question, what we do here is that we take one step forward, and instead of just predicting sandboxes, we see if we can find the actual age of a system based on wear and tear artifacts. So if we can find such a model, it can help the malware in order to compare the real age of a system with the claim age and then see if they are consistent with each other or not. Or it can help with the sandboxes in order to artificially age a system and then compare it with the desired claim age. So for this purpose, we train a linear regression and lasso regression, and to evaluate the model, we test it against an unseen data set of real systems. And as you see here, the residual error of real users is close to 0, which means that the model can predict the real age of a system. But when we use this model in order to predict the age of sandboxes, we see that the residual error is shifted to the right, which means that their claim age is much more than their real age, which means that they obviously are faking their ages. So, as a countermeasure against this new evasion technique, which we can consider two different approaches. The first approach is to detect probing activities, but the problem with this approach is that many of the features we extracted, they don't even invoke any system API calls, so they will be the same as like any benign samples, and also the attacker can also switch to a new set of artifacts. As a second approach, we may try to make the sandboxes to look like a real system, and for this purpose, we can try to clone a real system or try to artificially age a system. So if we clone a real system, the challenge is that we have privacy concerns because we need to remove all the personal information without touching wear and tear artifacts, and we also need to keep it always up to date. The second approach doesn't have the privacy concerns, but it would be difficult to understand if the wear and tear artifacts are really organic or not. So to conclude it, we systematically assess the threat of wear and tear artifact in order to evade sandboxes. And we also build a model in order to predict the real age of a system that can be used by sandboxes in order to see whether they look realistic or not. And finally, we discuss different directions of defenses. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions.
Hi, I'm Hao Sheng from UC Davis. I have two questions. The first is that how do you deal with the false positive, where the system is new, it's just been installed, and so it looks very fresh. So would your classifier think that it's a sandbox?
So for the false positive, it means that it's not a sandbox, but it's detected as a sandbox. So
it's a freshly installed system.
Yeah.
So, but it's not a sandbox. It's a real system on a physical machine. So how? So in this case, presumably your classifier would make a mistake, thinking that it's in a sandbox. So have you considered this?
You mean the systems of real users which look like a real, which is completely fresh?
Yes, it's just being installed.
Yeah. So this is the false positives of these cases. So the attacker would just miss those cases.
Okay. So another question is that you mentioned that the privacy concern is something that prevents you from using a real system, a real old system. But how about using a system, say, from a library machine, some public terminals, right? So because they're public, there shouldn't be any private data on them. So you take a snapshot of these systems and use that as to defeat this classifier. Because it's a real system. It looks real. It is real. So what's your comment on that?
So it's a real system, but still some private information are on that system, so you cannot use it in your sandbox.
Well, it's a public machine, right? It's a machine in the libraries, so it presumably you shouldn't store any sensitive information on those machines.
So it will endanger the user who has who is the owner of that machine, because
well, there's no owner of the machine. It's a public machine in the library. It'll probably say this is a public machine. Do not store any private information on the machine.
So I don't get the question.
There should not be any private data on the machine. It's a real machine, but so my point is that not all real machines contain private data.
So you cannot make sure that no private information is stored on that machine, even if it's a library machine or like any kinds of public machine.
Okay.
Hi, Piers O'Hanlon. I was just interested to see if you'd know how many bits of malware sort of use these techniques.
How many malware in the wild has used these techniques?
Yeah, like sort of try, yeah, how many percentage sort of use them to say, and what, do they typically sort of shut down their kind of bad behavior as a result of the detection? I mean, there was proposition about the WannaCry, that URL, the kind of kill switch, they said that was, but I didn't quite understand how that was detecting a VM. But anyway, I just wondered if you had data on.
No, we haven't studied how many malwares in the wild have been used this technique, because it's just the new techniques we have proposed. So it's possible that some malware has already used this technique, and they already evaded the sandboxes, so they are not detected that we can find them.
Okay.
So would you be surprised if you did run across a piece of malware in the next year that used a technique like this?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the logical sort of next move is then, let's see if we can work out how to make our real machines look like VMs, and then we'll shut off the...
So I'm trying to flip your question around. So your assumption is that if a VM looks like a VM, then probably you can't get your malware to run. So if I can, what's your comment on taking a real machine and make it look like a VM so that I won't get infected? So going back to an earlier question so far to the previous gentleman, I know for a fact that many ransomware families that study actually won't run if it detects it's a VM. So maybe what you do here may be a good way to prevent ransomware attacks, because you make yourself look like a VM. So what's your comment on that?
Can you just repeat your question? I didn't.
I'm saying that I'm trying to flip your model around. Instead of making VMs look like real machines, can we make real machines look like VMs? Say by decreasing its age and erasing registries so that you don't get infected.
Yeah, but when you need to touch different aspects of the system in order to make all the wear and tear artifacts to look realistic.
And what would be some of the more important artifacts to erase so as to immune yourself against attacks? We can probably take this offline. It's okay.
Sorry.
Thanks.
So I actually have a variation on that question. So maybe we'll try my version. I was looking through the list of features that you have. Oh, yeah. Let me start with, I like this work. I think it's really an interesting idea. I like the whole concept of it. I was trying to look through your features and try and determine, are these things that if I were going to set up a VM, I could just set the values on all of these things kind of immediately, so that the time it would take to set up a VM would still be a constant time kind of operation. So do you believe that all of the features could be set immediately, or do they actually require some time to elapse to take on their values?
The thing is that the problem we introduced here is just we try to show the feasibility of this this approach in order to evade sandboxes. So the features we collected is just some examples of wear and tear features. So in principle, there are many more features. As I said, an attacker can use more sophisticated features, which doesn't have any like privacy concerns, in order to see whether a system is something real, is a real system or is a sandbox. So there is a very large surface that can be like touched by an attacker. So and you need to like make all these like wear and tear artifacts to be inconsistent with each other. So I guess like many of these things can take time. So as I said, you need to like artificially age a system in a very sophisticated way. So we will not like try to raise something, but something is still inconsistent with that.
Thank you. All right, let's give a warm thanks to our speaker.